For 9 years, the Duke of Ravenglass never once removed his right glove, not at his own table, not at his own fireside, not before the servants who had served him for decades, nor the few guests brave enough to dine with a man the whole of England had decided was a monster. They had their theories, of course. They always do. Some said he hid a hideous burn out of vanity. Some said worse, that the scar beneath that glove was a punishment, the mark of a man who had killed his own brother in a fire 9 years before. They were certain of it. They whispered it behind their fans at every ball he did not attend. They were wrong about everything. Because tonight, his new bride, married to him for her family's debts, expecting a monster, braced to fear him, reached across the candlelight, took that gloved hand in both of hers, and quietly began to draw off the glove he had not let another living soul touch in 9 years. And the coldest man in England did not stop her. What Eleanor saw beneath that glove would shatter every cruel story London had ever told about her husband, because the scar was not the mark of a murderer. It was the mark of the bravest thing a brother has ever done. And the reason he had spent 9 years letting the world believe he was a monster was sitting, untouched and respectable, at a dinner table not 3 miles away. Stay with me. To understand tonight, you have to go back. And you have to understand the story that all of England believed. 9 years ago, there had been a fire. It happened at a great house during a glittering autumn party, and when the smoke cleared, 2 things were true. The Duke of Ravenglass, then a young man named Marcus, bore a terrible burn on his right hand that would never heal. And his younger brother, Captain James Ravenglass, the golden boy everyone adored, was dead. That much was fact. The rest, society invented. Because the surviving brother would not speak of it, Marcus Ravenglass came out of that fire changed, silent, cold, closed as a tomb. He never explained the scar. He never spoke his brother's name. He simply withdrew behind the walls of his estate and pulled a glove over his ruined hand and let the world say whatever it liked. And the world denied the truth, reached for the cruelest story it could find. They said Marcus had been jealous of his golden younger brother. They said there had been a quarrel that night. They said, in the worst whispers, the ones that followed him into every room for 9 years, that the fire had been no accident at all, that the cold Duke of Ravenglass had killed James, and the scar on his hand was God's own brand upon a murderer. There was no proof. There did not need to be. The Duke gave them nothing to disprove it, and a man who will not defend himself is, to society, as good as guilty. So why did he never defend himself? Why would an innocent man stand silent for 9 years and let the world call him a brother killer? The answer is the heart of this entire story, and it is so much more painful than the lie, because Marcus Ravenglass was not protecting himself. He was protecting someone who could no longer be protected any other way. Now, let me tell you how Eleanor came to marry a monster. Eleanor Whitmore was the eldest daughter of a good family gone bad with debt. Her father, a kind but hopeless man, had gambled and speculated the family fortune down to nothing, and by the autumn of Eleanor's 23rd year, the Whitmores were one missed payment from ruin. And then an offer came that no one expected. The Duke of Ravenglass, the scarred recluse, the man no respectable family would let near a daughter, offered to settle the entire Whitmore debt. Every penny, in exchange for one thing, a wife. The whole of society was scandalized. To send a gently bred girl into that house, to that man, it was as good as feeding her to a wolf. Eleanor's own aunt wept and called it a death sentence. But Eleanor looked at her terrified parents and her younger sisters, and the ruin closing in on all of them, and she made a choice. "I will do it," she said quietly. "I will marry him." "Eleanor, you cannot. The things they say about him, the fire—" "They say a great many things," Eleanor replied. "And I have noticed, Aunt, that the things people are most certain of are very often the things they know the least about." She lifted her chin. "I will not condemn a man I have never met on the strength of a rumor. I will go, and I will see him with my own eyes, and then I will know. Hold on to that. I will see him with my own eyes." Because Eleanor Whitmore had one quality that 9 years of London gossip did not. She actually looked at people. She noticed what others missed. And she was about to walk into a house full of secrets that everyone else had simply decided not to see. Ravenglass Hall was everything the rumors promised, vast, dim, and silent as held breath. The servants moved like ghosts, the curtains stayed drawn, and at the center of it all was the Duke himself, tall, severe, with dark hair graying early at the temples and gray eyes that seemed to look straight through a person and find them wanting, and always, always the glove. Fine black leather on his right hand, never removed, even at dinner, where he ate awkwardly with his left rather than bare it. Their first meeting was not warm. "You know what they say about me," the Duke said flatly the moment they were alone. Not a question. He stood by the cold hearth, watching her the way a man watches for a flinch. "You know what this marriage makes you, the wife of a monster. The whole of society pities you already." Eleanor regarded him steadily. "I know what they say," she agreed. "I notice you have not told me whether it's true." Something flickered in the gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps. He was not used to being answered. "Most people," he said slowly, "do not require me to." "Most people are lazy," said Eleanor. "It is easier to believe a story than to learn a truth. But I am going to be living in your house, Your Grace, possibly for the rest of my life. I would rather learn the truth." She paused. "So, I will not ask you about the fire. I will simply watch and listen and decide for myself what kind of man I have married." For a long moment, the Duke of Ravenglass said nothing at all, and then, very quietly, with something that was almost respect. "You are not what I expected, Lady Eleanor." "No," she said, "I rarely am." And so began the strangest courtship in England. A wife who had decided to see her husband clearly, in a house built entirely to keep everyone from seeing anything. It would take her weeks. But Eleanor was patient, and Eleanor was watchful, and the first thing she noticed was the glove. Eleanor began to collect small observations the way other women collected lace, but she did not collect them from a distance. She asked. One morning, she found the old housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, arranging flowers, and she said lightly, "The servants here are very loyal to His Grace. I confess I expected them to be afraid of him. They are not, are they?" Mrs. Fairfax's hands went still on the stems. "Afraid of him?" The old woman's voice sharpened, almost offended. "My lady, there is not one soul under this roof who would let a word be said against that man. Not one." She caught herself, pressed her lips together. "Forgive me. I have said too much." "You've said almost nothing," Eleanor replied gently. "But you've told me a great deal. A cruel master is feared, Mrs. Fairfax. He is not protected." She let that sit. "You all guard him, like he's the one who's been hurt." The old woman looked at her for a long, measuring moment, and then turned back to her flowers without another word. But her eyes were wet, so Eleanor kept watching, and the house kept giving up its secrets one careful piece at a time. She noticed that the Duke could not bear to enter the long gallery, where one portrait, a laughing young man in a captain's uniform, hung draped in black and was never uncovered. She noticed that sometimes, alone by the fire, he would hold his gloved right hand in his left and simply sit with it. The way you hold something that hurts, the way you hold something you cannot put down. And she noticed the way the whole house went silent whenever one name was spoken. The brother, James. One evening, she said it deliberately, watching his face. "Your brother, Captain James. Will you tell me about him?" The Duke went very still. "They say I killed him," he said. "I did not ask what they say. I asked you to tell me about your brother." And for just a moment, just one, the cold mask cracked, and Eleanor saw beneath it something she had not expected to find in the face of a monster. She saw grief, vast, old, unbearable grief. "He was," the Duke said very quietly, "the best person I have ever known, and I would give this entire dukedom and every year of my life to have him back." Then the mask closed again. "That is all I will say. A man who murdered his brother does not speak of him like that." Eleanor knew it in her bones. Whatever had happened in that fire 9 years ago, the cold Duke of Ravenglass had loved his brother, loved him still, with a grief that had not faded in 9 years. And that single observation set Eleanor on the path to the truth. She just needed one more piece, and it walked through the front door 3 days later, in the form of a charming, smiling guest named Lord Crail. The missing piece arrived 3 days later, smiling. Lord Crail was everything the Duke was not: warm, easy, quick to laugh. He called at Ravenglass Hall as an old acquaintance, and Eleanor disliked him on sight without quite knowing why. So, as always, she watched, and what she saw did not make sense. Crail was charming to everyone, but when he looked at the Duke, beneath all that warmth, there was fear. And the Duke looked back at this harmless, smiling guest with a contained fury Eleanor could feel across the room like heat off a stove. These two men hated each other, and both were carefully pretending not to. Then, at dinner, Crail raised his glass with an easy smile. To absent friends, to poor James, gone 9 years now. Such a tragedy, such a reckless boy, wasn't he? Always so careless with a lamp. And Eleanor, watching, always watching, saw two things in the same instant. She saw the Duke's gloved hand close into a fist so tight the leather creaked, and she saw Lord Crail watch him do it, with the small, satisfied look of a man pressing on a bruise to prove it still hurts, careless with a lamp. In one cruel little toast, Lord Crail had told Eleanor more than 9 years of gossip ever had. The fire had something to do with a lamp, and the story that James had been reckless with it, the story that blamed the dead boy, was a story that made the Duke clench his ruined hand in silent rage. Why would an innocent toast enrage him? Unless the story was a lie. Unless someone had spent 9 years telling it. Eleanor was very close now. She just had to get the Duke to do the one thing he had not done in 9 years. Tell the truth. It happened by the fire, late, after Crail had finally gone. The Duke sat staring into the flames, his gloved hand held in his left, and Eleanor sat across from him and did not look away. "You hate him," she said quietly. "Lord Crail, and he is afraid of you, and tonight, when he called your brother careless with a lamp, you nearly broke your own hand keeping yourself still." She leaned forward. "Marcus, I have watched you for weeks. You are not a monster. A monster does not grieve like you grieve. So I'm going to ask you one question, and I'm going to ask it as your wife, who is on your side, and who is the one person in England who has never once believed the story." She took a breath. What really happened in that fire? And the Duke of Ravenglass, who had carried it alone for 9 years, looked at the one person who had refused to condemn him, and something 9 years sealed finally broke open. "It was Crail's lamp," he said. The words came rough, like they hurt to speak. "It was Crail's house, Crail's party, Crail's lamp. And Crail was drunk, and he knocked it into the curtains, and the room went up in seconds. And then he ran. He saved himself, and he left a dozen people in a burning room, and one of them was James." His voice shook. "I went back in for him. I found him pinned under a fallen beam, and it was burning, and I took hold of it, with my hand. I held it off him long enough for the others to pull him free." He looked down at the gloved hand. "That is what is under the glove, Eleanor, not vanity, not a murderer's brand. The hand I used to lift a burning beam off my brother's chest." Eleanor's eyes were full. "And James? He lived 3 days." The Duke's voice was barely a whisper now. "And then he died anyway. And I have worn this glove for 9 years, because every time I see what's beneath it, I see that I was strong enough to hold the beam, and not strong enough to save him." And slowly, slowly, across the candlelight, Eleanor reached out and took that gloved hand in both of hers and began gently to draw the glove away. And he let her. Beneath it was a hand ravaged by old fire, scarred, knotted, the mark of the bravest thing a brother has ever done. Eleanor lifted it to her lips and kissed the ruined palm. "That is not the hand of a monster," she whispered. "That is the hand of the best man I have ever met. If your heart just broke a little, if you're sitting there realizing that the man the whole world called a monster spent 9 years carrying a wound he earned, saving the brother they accused him of killing, then you already understand what this channel is about. The ones the world judges without ever looking. The quiet, the scarred, the misunderstood. That's every story I tell here. Subscribe and stay with me to the end, because what Eleanor does next is the part you'll remember. But Eleanor, being Eleanor, had one more question, the most important one. "Marcus," she said softly, still holding his bared hand, "if it was Crail's lamp, if Crail started the fire and ran, then why does the whole world blame you? Why does that man sit at your table and toast your brother as careless when he is the one who did this? Why have you let them call you a murderer for 9 years when the truth would clear you in an instant? And here, at last, was the deepest wound of all. Because of what Crail holds, the Duke said. He explained it slowly. In the weeks before the fire, James, young, foolish, alive, had fallen deep into gambling debt to Lord Crail, thousands of pounds, and worse. In his desperation, James had signed something, a document, a promise against the family's estate that, if Crail ever produced it, would not only ruin the Ravenglass fortune, but would brand James himself a fraud and a cheat in the eyes of all society. When James died, Marcus said, Crail came to me. He said he would tell the world the fire was my doing, and produce James's debts and that signed paper to prove our family was rotten, that James was a swindler who died owing fortunes he'd tried to cheat his way out of. He would destroy my brother's name and our house together, unless I stayed silent, unless I let the world blame me for the fire and never spoke a word against him. He looked at Eleanor with 9 years of exhaustion in his eyes, so I had a choice. Let the world know the truth, and watch them drag my dead brother's name through the mud, brand him a cheat and a fool, destroy everything he was, or take the blame myself. Wear the glove, be the monster, and let James be remembered as the golden boy everyone loved. His jaw tightened. I chose my brother. He could not defend himself anymore, so I did it for him, for 9 years. Sit with the weight of that. Marcus Ravenglass did not stay silent out of weakness. He let the entire world believe he murdered his brother. He accepted a monster's reputation, a life of isolation, 9 years of whispered cruelty, so that his dead brother could be remembered with honor. He took the scar on his hand, and then he took a second scar on his name, both to protect a man who could no longer be hurt or helped. That is not the act of a monster. That is the most loyal thing I have ever heard. And Eleanor, who had spent weeks refusing to believe the easy story, was not about to let it stand for 1 day longer. No, Eleanor said. The Duke blinked. No, 9 years is enough. You have protected James long enough, Marcus. And you have done it the only way you knew how. But you have been fighting this war alone, and you have been losing it because you have been playing defense against a man who holds one weapon. She rose, and there was steel in her now. So, we are going to take his weapon away. Eleanor, the paper James signed, if Crail produces it, then we make it worthless before he can. Her mind was already moving, quick and precise. You said James signed it under pressure, deep in debt, to a man who got him drunk and ruined him on purpose. Marcus, that is not a debt of honor. That is predatory. If we can prove how Crail operated, that he targeted young men, got them in their cups, loaded the games, lured them into debts they could never pay, then James's paper isn't proof your brother was a cheat. It's proof your brother was a victim. And Crail isn't a wronged creditor. He's a swindler who has been getting away with it for 9 years. She turned to him, eyes blazing. I notice things, Marcus. It is the only thing I have ever been good at, and I will wager that a man who has cheated one young fool has cheated a dozen, and that some of them, or their families, would be very glad to finally speak. We don't defend against Crail's weapon. We build a case that he is exactly what he is, and then he will be far too busy saving his own neck to ever threaten yours again. And there is the turn. For 9 years, Marcus had only ever played defense, protecting, hiding, absorbing blow after blow to keep his brother safe. It took Eleanor, the woman who noticed things, to see the obvious truth he was too close to see. The way to stop a man holding a secret is not to keep hiding from it. It is to expose him first. She didn't need to protect James from Crail's lie. She needed to prove Crail was a liar, and then every lie he held would turn to dust. Eleanor's instinct was right. A man who has cheated one young fool has cheated many, and somewhere out there were the others. She found the first one in a damp set of rooms above a chandler's shop, a young man named Thomas Howell, who had once had a future. He almost shut the door in her face. Then she said the name Crail and watched him go white. I'm not here to collect a debt, Eleanor said gently. I'm here because I think a man wronged you, and I think you've been carrying it alone, the way my husband has, for a very long time. Howell let her in. And then, in a halting voice, for the first time in 6 years, he told someone the truth. How Crail had befriended him, flattered him, filled his glass again, and steered him, smiling, into games that Howell only understood much later were rigged. How the debts had climbed past anything he could pay. How Crail had stopped smiling then, and produced the papers, and named his price: money, silence, ruin. How Howell's father had died of the shame of it. "I thought it was my fault," Howell whispered, his hands shaking. "For years I thought I was weak, I was a fool, I deserved it. He made me think that. That's how he does it. He ruins you, and then he makes you believe you ruined yourself, so you'll never speak." Eleanor reached across and took his trembling hands in both of hers, the same way she had taken her husband's scarred one. "You did not ruin yourself," she said. "A predator chose you because you were young and trusting and alone. That is not weakness, Mr. Howell, and you are not alone anymore." She held his gaze. "There are others, and I think it is time, finally, that all of you stopped being ashamed of what he did. Will you tell the truth, in writing, where it counts? Not for revenge, for the next boy he hasn't ruined yet." Thomas Howell wept, and then he said yes, and he was the first of 11. Because once one frightened man finally spoke, the others found their courage too, a chain of ruined young men who had each spent years believing they were the only one, the only fool, secretly the guilty one. Eleanor gave them the one thing none of them had ever had, someone who believed them, and one by one, their statements became a single damning truth that no forged paper in Lord Crail's pocket could survive. The hunter had no idea the hunted were about to turn around. Crail learned it was over in the Duke's own drawing room. He came smiling, as always, expecting the usual game, a little needling, a little reminder of the leash he'd held for 9 years. He found instead the Duke of Ravenglass standing at the head of the room with his bare, scarred right hand resting openly on the table for all to see. The glove was gone. "Take a good look, Crail," Marcus said quietly. "Everyone will be seeing it soon enough, and I am going to tell them exactly how I came by it." Crail's smile flickered. "I would think very carefully, Your Grace. You know what I hold. One word from me about poor James and his debts and that signed paper. And your family." "Produce it," Eleanor said. Crail turned, startled, as though a piece of furniture had spoken. "Produce James's paper. Please, do." She laid a thick folder on the table beside her husband's scarred hand. "Because the moment you do, it becomes evidence in this. Statements from 11 men, Lord Crail. 11 so far. Mr. Howell, young Lord Ashby, the Pemberton boy before he shot himself, all telling the very same story. How you got them drunk, how you loaded your games, how you lured them into debts you knew they could never pay, and then bled them or silenced them." Her voice was cold and clear. "Produce James's paper, and you don't ruin us. You simply add your own signature to the proof that you are the most accomplished swindler in England. The choice, my lord, is entirely yours." The color drained from Lord Crail's face, because for 9 years he had held exactly one card, and Eleanor had just laid down the entire rest of the deck. And just like that, the weapon Crail had used to imprison an innocent man for 9 years turned to ash in his hand. He could not expose James without exposing himself. He could not ruin the Ravenglass name without hanging his own. The secret that had given him all his power only had power as long as no one was brave enough to drag the rest of the truth into the light. And Eleanor had just dragged all of it into the light at once. Lord Crail did not last the season. Faced with 11 sworn statements and a duke who no longer had any reason to stay silent, he did what cowards do when cornered. He ran. He fled England under a cloud of ruin, his fortune frozen, his name finished, pursued by the families of every young man he had destroyed. He never produced James's paper. He never dared. He spent the rest of his life abroad, poor and disgraced, which was 9 years overdue. And Marcus Ravenglass, at last, told the truth. Not loudly, not vengefully, but fully. The real story of the fire spread through London the way the lie once had. How the Duke had gone back into the flames, how he had held a burning beam off his dying brother with his bare hand, how he had carried both the scar and the blame for 9 years to protect a brother who could not protect himself. The whispers changed. The man they had called a monster, they now understood, had been a hero all along. And more than a hero, a man who had given up his own good name as the final gift to a brother he loved. And in the long gallery of Ravenglass Hall, for the first time in 9 years, the black drape came down from the portrait of a laughing young man in a captain's uniform. James Ravenglass could be looked upon again, remembered at last for exactly what he was, beloved and innocent and avenged. 1 year later, the Duke of Ravenglass sat at his own dinner table, with his bare right hand resting easily on the cloth in the warm light of a house that had finally opened its curtains. He did not hide the scar anymore. He had stopped the day Eleanor kissed it. She had taught him something it took her about 5 minutes to teach and him 9 years to learn, that the scar was not his shame. It was his proof, the mark of the one night he had been brave enough, and the love that had cost him everything and been worth it anyway. The house was warm now, full of light and guests who came gladly, and the laughter of a man who had forgotten for 9 years that he was allowed to laugh. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked him across the table. Marcus looked down at his scarred hand and then at his wife, the woman who had been bought to pay a debt, who had walked into a monster's house and simply refused to believe the easy story about him. That for 9 years, he said, every single person who looked at me saw a monster, and then one person looked harder. He turned his ruined palm up, open, unashamed. "You did not save me from the fire, Eleanor, but you are the only one who ever bothered to ask how I got burned." She reached across and laced her fingers through his scarred ones. "Someone had to," she said. "The whole world was so very busy being certain. So here is what I want you to carry with you tonight. For 9 years, the whole world looked at the Duke of Ravenglass and saw a monster. They saw the glove and invented a murderer. They saw the silence and called it guilt. They were so certain, and they were wrong about every single thing, because the easiest story is almost never the true one. The man they called a killer was the bravest brother who ever lived. The scar they called a punishment was a medal, and the silence they called guilt was the loudest act of love in the whole sad tale. A man giving up his own name to protect someone who could no longer protect himself. And the one person who saw the truth was not the cleverest or the most powerful or the most certain. She was simply the one who looked harder, who refused to condemn a man on a rumor, who asked what really happened instead of assuming she already knew. So, the next time the whole world is certain about someone, certain they're cold, certain they're guilty, certain they're a monster, be the one who looks harder. Be the one who asks how they got burned, instead of assuming they deserved it. Because almost everyone you will ever meet is wearing a glove over some wound the world has decided to misunderstand. And sometimes all it takes to change a person's entire life is one human being willing to finally look beneath it. If Marcus and Eleanor's story moved you tonight, if you believe the misunderstood ones, the scarred ones, the ones the world judges without ever looking, deserve to finally be seen, then you're exactly who I make these stories for. You're my kind of person. Subscribe and turn on the bell so the next one always finds you. And tell me in the comments, did you guess what was beneath the glove? And would you have looked harder or believed the easy story? I read every single one. Next week, a duke married a woman who had not spoken a word in 3 years, and he was the only one who knew she wasn't broken. She was hiding. Your next story is already waiting.